Welcome to BuzzHouse, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can hear all the buzz around multifamily housing, with all the info you need to help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Hi, I'm Don Bernards, the principal in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrick Gibson, a principal at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Let's get started. On the BuzzHouse, we many times reference the shortage of affordable housing and talk about legislation and innovative financing to try to help with housing production. It really does take the industry looking at all angles to try and find a path to making it more efficient and affordable to increase production. Today, our guest in the BuzzHouse is Dan Hereth, Secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services. Welcome, Dan. Thanks for joining us today.
Don, Garrick, thanks for having me.
Perfect. You might be asking yourself, what's the connection between the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services and affordable housing? And that connection is around building codes. We'll be discussing some ideas around building codes and housing affordability and production today. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Garrick, who's going to jump right into our questions with Dan. Garrick?
Thanks for that intro, Don, and thanks, Dan, for being on our show on BuzzHouse. So before we jump in with some questions, would you please give our listeners some insight into the role of the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services is really focused on, as you would expect, safety. We consider ourselves Wisconsin's safety agency, and we do a lot of the little things that make Wisconsin safe so people don't have to think about them. So whether that's our building codes, which we'll be talking about today, or that's establishing minimum standards for licensed professionals, your doctors, your nurses, your tattoo artists, even your CPAs. We also do things like public sector occupational safety. We inspect and evaluate amusement rides. The list kind of goes on and on and on. We're kind of a potpourri of a government agency. But at the heart of all that is, again, keeping the people of Wisconsin safe and making sure that they all don't have to think about the things that we're thinking about every single day.
Well, thanks for that intro, Dan, and I'm glad somebody's thinking about it, right? Because we all need safety in our lives. Well, let's jump into some questions. When Don and I are sitting here and we're thinking about affordable housing production, we don't typically go straight to like building codes. So what is the thesis behind your strategy of looking at these building codes?
Yeah, really, it's all about maximizing returns, both from a public safety perspective, but also from a building code flexibility perspective. You may be very familiar that the building code is often seen as this prescriptive document. You must do these things because otherwise the building isn't safe. And I think while the building code provides a very good foundation for the safety of our built environment, it also provides a lot of flexibility. And what we want to do is build on that flexibility in ways that become more accessible to builders and developers and people who are looking to bring more housing onto the market more affordably. But once again, without sacrificing public safety. Oftentimes, public safety and building affordability is seen as at odds with one another, and we very much believe you can have your cake and eat it too. Sometimes it's the small things that really make a big difference in terms of safety, and I'll give you one really great example of that. So many years ago, self-closing doors was not a requirement in multifamily housing. And then at some point, quite frankly, probably a little before my time, they added that as a requirement. Self-closing doors became a requirement in multifamily housing. And that single contribution, that single requirement change, while very small from an overall costing perspective, I mean, you're talking about at $50, $60 a pop and a door arm. So relatively small investment in the scheme of a whole building makes a massive difference in the spread of, in this case, fire potentially from unit to unit. And so I think there are lots of small things that we can do to improve safety. I think the other thing is I like to share with people that updating building codes is not more regulation, right? People sometimes think of updating a building code as more regulation. And it very much is just new regulation and different regulation, often not more regulation. It's about meeting current standards. It's about bringing on new technologies. And I think that's an area where I really focus on is, look, over the course of the history of the building code, every single cycle we're adopting new technologies and we're kind of stacking these things one on top of another. And so at a certain point, can we start to revisit some of the long-held beliefs that we have about what makes us truly safe in a built structure and say, okay, maybe in 1975, this was new and this made us safe. But now that we've added these 6 other features to this building in subsequent building codes, do we still need some of the features that might have existed years or even decades ago?
Perfect. Dan, I think that's a great segue to my next question. And I had a chance to spend a little bit of time with you last week and so forth. And one item we discussed was the single stairwell building. What is the current code around stairwells and multifamily buildings? And what's kind of your study or thoughts around the stairwells and so forth regarding then housing affordability and construction?
Well, for me, I think first and foremost, last week was all about our exploration of that concept. Nationally, you're seeing some cities adopt single stairwell and primarily for up to 6-story buildings. Our current code, our own code, only allows single stairwell up to a 3-story building. Now, let me get a little bit more specific. So, the code doesn't necessarily address stairwells specifically. What it addresses is means of egress. And so, in a 1 to 3-story building, you need only one means of egress for up to that 3 stories. Once you exceed that in Wisconsin currently, you're required to have at least 2 means of egress. And so that's where you get dual stairwell. Is often that's the way it manifests in buildings 4 to 6 stories in Wisconsin currently is in 2 stairwells. I think it's an interesting concept. There's some emerging work nationally to say that when you do the right things in combination with a single stairwell, more fire rated material, obviously sprinkler systems throughout, other newer technologies, some HVAC specifications and layouts. You can add some of these things to these spaces that dramatically improve the safety of the spaces, despite maybe only having 1 stairwell as opposed to 2. What does that mean for the cost of housing? Well, it can dramatically drive down the cost of housing. Some estimates have it being anywhere from 13 to 22%, but a lot of that is tied up in land acquisition costs. I think what above and beyond the cost, I think it starts to make things like urban infill more realistic, right? So as opposed to buying 1 lot or buying rather 2 to 3 lots all right next to each other, as a developer who knows if that opportunity will even present itself to have that many available lots adjacent to one another, you can start to build 4 to 6-story structures on a single standard city lot to, again, infill some of those spaces in more urban environments. But this can't be a one-sided conversation. Well, there's a lot of interest. Obviously, we have a national housing shortage, and building more housing is the single most effective way to drive down homelessness. We also have to continue to think about public safety. I think that's why we're having meetings with our fire service, and we really want to get the perspective of folks on the ground who care deeply about public safety. One of the things I didn't mention about our agency is we actually regulate firefighter safety and firefighting in the state of Wisconsin. And so making sure that our fire service is a part of that conversation is critical to us as a department. I'll just point out in Wisconsin, most of our firefighting service is actually a volunteer basis firefighting service. And so when you start to look at the differing capabilities of local fire departments to ensure public safety from a response perspective, I think however this moves forward, we have to bear that in mind. Like the answer in Milwaukee or Madison or Eau Claire or Green Bay might not be the right answer in Brillion or one of these other small communities. We really have to take a whole of Wisconsin approach to solutioning the housing crisis.
Very good. Dan, thanks for that detailed response. And maybe, again, a nice follow up to that analysis and thinking about different sizes for different size cities. What is the process to update the state building code and to allow that kind of flexibility as well?
Yeah, currently Wisconsin has a statewide code. So juxtapose that to our neighbor to the south, Illinois, where each individual city and community can have its own building code requirements. And so flexibility on the local level does become challenging, but it is something that we continue to look at because whether it's fire codes or it's things like basement dwellings, different places are going to have different needs and different requirements. In terms of updating the code, the process for that, it can be quite an arduous process. Currently, it's a 12 to 18-month process. It starts with all sorts of bureaucratic steps. You have scope statements, and then you have public hearings, and you have pre-scope hearings, and then you have meetings of the Building Code Council. And then they pull together a package, and then we send that off to the legislature for more public hearings. And so you can see very quickly how we get to that 12 to 18-month figure. But that process is important, right? At the end of the day, that process is what helps us take into consideration those perspectives, whether you're talking about our smallest communities or our very largest.
Thanks, Dan. Now, you mentioned taking in those perspectives. So that leads me to, say, our listeners. If they have ideas on building codes, how does someone discuss this with the department so that it gets in there for discussion?
Yeah, very simply, just email DSPS Practice FAQ 3 at wisconsin.gov. Again, that's DSPS Practice FAQ 3 at wisconsin.gov. All of that goes straight to our folks who manage our building code council, and they'll work with people who have suggestions to get those suggestions on the council agenda for discussion. And who knows, they might make it into the next building code update. The other thing I would suggest, and this gets a little bit, I guess, a level deeper, is the International Building Code, the IBC. Nationally, they really drive the conversation around codes. And a lot of states, including Wisconsin, we take our cues from the folks at IBC when looking at new codes. So they have a substantially similar code writing process where they take in public comment and suggestions from folks across the nation. And so that's another place people can reach out to as a part of the code development process.
Very good. That's it for this episode of the BuzzHouse, catching up with Dan Hereth, the Secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services, discussing how analyzing and updating building codes can factor into affordable and attainable housing. Thanks very much, Dan, for joining us today. Really appreciate your time.
Garrick and Don, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Perfect. Once again, I'm Don Bernards.
And I'm Garrick Gibson.
Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. If you have a suggestion for the show, email us at build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD at bakertilly.com. See you next time on BuzzHouse.